Last time we looked at the way that Kansas fell apart into sectarian violence over the issue of slavery, and today we're going to look at how the country is going to fall apart into violence, chaos, score settling, and set us up for the bloodiest conflict in American history. So let's look how things went from bad to worse. The election of 1856 is really the one that set the stage for the split and the divide and eventually the Civil War. In the election of 1856, we were still sort of reorganizing the party systems after the collapse of the second party system. You'll of course remember that the Whig Party sort of tore itself apart over slavery, and honestly, I mean the Democratic Party tore itself apart over slavery too, but not to as big an extent. And so this is a chaotic election with a lot of different moving pieces, and it's somewhat complicated. So the Democrats are going to go with a pure pro-slavery platform. And they're going to nominate a guy named James Buchanan. He was from Pennsylvania, but he was very strongly pro-slavery due to his sort of ill-defined connection with Senator Rufus King of Alabama. And so he had like this relationship with this Alabama senator, and it made him very sort of pro-Southern. And he had the added advantage that he was in England during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, so no one could blame him for any of this chaos. But as we can clearly see here, at least according to this political cartoon, the Democrats had kept gone all in with the cause of slavery, and James Buchanan is right there with that whole deal. So the Republican Party also formed during this time period. We talked about how, in previous lectures, how the Kansas-Nebraska Act represented or was one of the sort of catalysts for pulling together the Republican Party, but the Republican Party had a lot of other sort of components to it as well. Because, of course, so sure, you've got the cause of slavery, but they were also the party of reform, sort of like the Whig Party was. So like the temperance people were there, the women's rights people, all of those sort of issues or people who were associated with those issues, and the people who favored the Whig economic platform were on that side. And so the Republican Party is also going to have all the people who want the protective tariff, who are interested in building infrastructure, stuff like that. So that's the Republican Party, and they're going to nominate John C. Fremont, who was a hero of the Mexican-American War, sort of following along with their Whig roots, nominating a popular general. So we see John C. Fremont over there on the right. And we're also going to see a third-party candidate, sort of. The Whig Party isn't totally dead, but they've sort of like all of the people who were not nativist have left. And so the remnants of the Whig Party are going to join together with the American Party and nominate Millard Fillmore, a former president who had ascended to the presidency, as you remember, as their candidate. And he's going to, honestly, he's not going to run. He's going to be nominated as a candidate. He's going to be on the ballot. And nativists, people who don't want immigration, are going to campaign for him. And he's going to end up being sort of a spoiler in this election. So here he is keeping John C. Fremont and the Republicans, who this cartoonist has decided should be depicted as rats, out of government. And there's a massive amount of racism as a part of this election. And so here we see a pro-democratic message, just with a really racist picture of an African American and implying that white people should vote Democratic. So messy. In the end, James Buchanan is going to win the election because the vote is going to be split. Here we see John C. Fremont trying to take a shot. Buchanan had a variety of awesome nicknames. Old Buck is sort of an obvious one, so here he is as a deer. But he was also known as the Old Public Functionary, which is kind of a ridiculous name. But anyway, so and there was some belief that. Some belief, of course, by the American Party that Millard Fillmore would also have a shot, but clearly not. So your end result is this. The only one state is won by Millard Fillmore, and that's, of course, as you can see, Maryland. But he gets 22% of the popular vote, which is a significant portion. And so you can see Buchanan wins a plurality of the popular vote, more than anyone else, but not half. But easily wins the electoral vote by winning all of the South and some of the border states where the vote was split between Fillmore and Fremont. And so we get James Buchanan as president. I don't want to say noteworthy because honestly James Buchanan is not noteworthy for anything, but presidential just random trivia here. He was the only non-married president, which led to some significant questions about his relationship with Rufus King. He was a Democrat, obviously, and he was pro-slavery despite the fact that he was Northern, which gave him some pull in both regions. So there's James Buchanan. He's generally considered to be one of the least competent presidents, and when it became clear that the Civil War was happening, he may have allowed members of his cabinet from the South to steal U.S. Army, to start moving U.S. Army surplus to southern states in preparation for the Civil War. So yeah, not the best president. The Dred Scott decision was one of the worst moments of James Buchanan's pretty awful presidency, because the Dred Scott decision was a Supreme Court case where a slave named Dred Scott brought suit against his owner, who had brought him into first a free state in Illinois and then a free territory in Minnesota. And most states and territories, or at least the ones in the Northeast, had laws by which if a slave lived for longer than 30 days in the territory, they would become free. But the territory of Minnesota did not have such a requirement yet. But Dred Scott argued, if I'm living in a free state or a free territory, I should become free at some point. And so he sued his owner, and the case got all the way to the Supreme Court. It took about 4 or 5 years to get all the way through the court system. And what you ended up getting is probably the worst Supreme Court ruling of all time. Under pressure from Buchanan, who got him enough of a majority to get this ruling passed, Roger B. Taney argued that, one, he ruled against Scott and said, no, you're not free. But he also argued and ruled that not only was Scott not free, but he didn't even have the right to sue in court. And he said that was because African Americans were not citizens, and therefore were not entitled to any of the rights that citizens should have in the Constitution, and were not privy to any of the sort of principles in the Declaration of Independence. And so he not only argued that Dred Scott does not become free by coming to a free territory, but he argued that African Americans aren't legally people, which is just horrendous, and it would take a constitutional amendment to overturn this Supreme Court case after the Civil War. So this decision is just awful for abolitionists for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously the black people aren't legally people thing is just horrible. But the other problem is now the Supreme Court has ruled that if you bring a slave into a free territory or a free state, they don't necessarily become free. And so what does that mean about the divide between free territories and slave territories? I mean, what does it mean to be a free territory if slave owners can just bring slaves in? And so the Dred Scott decision really blew up any sort of attempt at compromise. The other issue that really galvanized people was the caning of Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, and he gave a speech called "The Crime Against Kansas," where he ended up insulting an older senator from South Carolina. And so a younger member of the South Carolinian congressional delegation took offense at this and decided to take matters into his own hands. And so as Sumner was leaving the Senate for a day, a guy named Preston Brooks came up to him and started just pounding on him with his cane. And so knocked him to the ground and beat him senseless, and then eventually the cane broke. And then he was sort of forced to stop. And so the caning of Charles Sumner, the attack by one member of Congress on another in the Capitol building, obviously clearly divided people. Preston Brooks was then expelled, but he was reelected. And throughout the South, a bunch of people sent him canes as sort of tokens of their esteem for this attack on this abolitionist who they believed had insulted their honor. And so clearly, when half of the country sees this as a brutal attack and the other half sees it as like righteous justice, this demonstrates how far these two positions are apart. And so all of this leads to the solidification of the Republican Party. pushing anyone who was on the fence out of either the Democratic Party, if you were still a free soiler, or out of the Whig Party as it finally dissolves. And so the Republican Party, you can see here, this is a pro-Republican or pro-Sumner argument, demonstrating that he's using, the higher methods of persuasion by arguing this stuff, and that the Southerner, that Preston Brooks is just a brute. So, and here we see, of course, a Republican tract about bleeding Kansas, and so as that stuff is publicized, it again strengthens the fault lines between the two sides. And so the Republican Party figures out their platform. It's going to be an anti-slavery party, and it's going to be it's also going to have a sort of Whig-ish sort of reform and economic platform. And so they're going to be transcontinental railroad, pro-tariffs, stuff like that. Yeah. And of course, it's going to be an anti-slavery party. So, the Free Soilers, anti-slavery Democrats, conscience Whigs, all of these people are going to sort of consolidate together to form this new Republican Party. The symbol of this party ends up becoming Abraham Lincoln, sort of by chance, mostly. Lincoln was, of course, a young politician from Illinois. We had briefly talked about him earlier when we talked about sort of the old Midwest. He literally grew up in a log cabin, unlike a number of the other presidents who claimed they grew up in log cabins. Lincoln literally grew up in a log cabin. And he became famous, or one of the things that he was most known for was splitting rails for fences, which demonstrated his hard work and sort of rags to riches story, because eventually he became a lawyer and then became a successful politician. But when he was young, he was splitting his own rails for fences, and so one of the nicknames that Abe got was the rail splitter for splitting rails. And when we see Lincoln political cartoons, he's almost always going to be holding a split rail to sort of represent that sort of blue collar background, his common manness, as it were. Lincoln became a national celebrity in what are known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which of course any of you who are in debate know about, but they were a series of famous debates between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln to try to sway the Illinois Congress, basically, to fill a Senate seat. And so they traveled around, and they, had these really sort of complex debates where they kept trying to trap each other on legal issues. And Lincoln would sort of pound Douglas on popular sovereignty, and Douglas would attack Lincoln for being, too pro-abolition and stuff like that. And in the end, the Freeport Doctrine was probably the most famous thing to come out of this. And so, where Lincoln got Douglas to admit that territories could pass laws to undermine slavery, which of course outraged the Democrats, because the Dred Scott case, obviously said that if you bring an enslaved person to a free territory, they don't become free. And so Lincoln, of course, asked him the question, well, is there any way then to exclude slavery from a territory? Because popular sovereignty should imply that there is. And Douglas said that there was. And this, of course, outraged the Southern delegation. And so when Douglas becomes the candidate for president, he's going to lose a lot of Southern support through after he issues or articulates what's known as the Freeport Doctrine. So there's Lincoln again for some reason. One of the other things, and James Buchanan's presidency was just a train wreck in almost any sense of the word, but we also got an economic depression, which usually leads to changes in power, changes in the party in charge. And so the Panic of 1857 was sort of caused by a previous panic in England the year before, partially by over-speculation. A speculative bubble had formed in railroad construction from the boom of that decade, and partially because of inflation from the California gold rush. I mean, you think it's great when the market is flooded with tons of gold, but then, of course, prices start to rise, and for the average worker who's probably not getting a lot of this gold, life is not necessarily great. And so this depression, it started with the demise of the Reading Railroad, which then kicked off the failure in this Ohio bank, and before you know it, you started getting these bank panics. And of course, when banks go out of business, it's terrible for people because we didn't have any, there was no FDIC at this point, and so when the bank collapses, you're just done. So it led to this bank panic, and the whole thing totally blew up, and the Buchanan government basically did nothing to stop it, and the economy went into a sharp decline and a depression. We also got John Brown's raid during this time period, which was also very sort of divisive. John Brown, of course, escaped from Bleeding, Kansas, and now he headed east to try to set up a general slave revolt. And I'm not going to go into tons of detail here. It's really interesting. You can read up on it if you want. But his basic plan was to seize a federal armory, get all the weapons, distribute them to slaves, and start a massive slave insurrection in Virginia. And so here's John Brown with a little bit older and beardier. So he attacks Harper's Ferry, which is a federal arsenal. And the Virginia militia shows up, and they trap him there, and his whole party is killed, and he is captured. Ironically, Robert E. Lee, or maybe not ironically, but Robert E. Lee was part of the Virginia militia company that captured him. So, John Brown caught, captured, and then killed. He's executed for treason, as one would be when you go and attack a federal armory. But his death and how people felt about it continue to represent like the divide between North and South at this point. Because, of course, for Southerners, he's a criminal. I mean, he's a criminal anyway. He's attacking a federal armory. But for Southerners, he's the worst of criminals. And Northerners who support him, or anyone who supports him, is supporting disorder and chaos. But for Northerners, he became like this symbol of righteous vengeance and action, disobeying unjust laws and trying to bring freedom to people who didn't have it. And so there was this famous song called John Brown's Body that's eventually, the tune of it became the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But it basically said that he died for righteous reasons and all this. And so he was a martyr for the cause. And so how people felt about John Brown really also sort of mirrored how they felt about the debate over slavery in general. And so all of these fault lines created a huge divide between North and South and set the stage for, of course, this massive schism that's going to just tear the country apart.